Brought to you by IOCO, Africa's leading integrated technology services company. It's time for Tech Talk. Now, as AI investment grows, policymakers need to keep pace with the innovation. South Africa's Communications and Digital Technology Minister, Malatsi, has urged G20 leaders to look into frameworks that member states can adopt to help regulate the technology. And Business Day's Mudiwa Gavaza joins us with more detail. Mudiwa, thanks so much for your time this afternoon. Sometime last week when we did chat, we spoke about a digital divide in the country, and I'm sure that's also playing out across the continent as well. In the talks that were had this week by the G20 members and that workforce, how are they looking to address that in particular before we can get into, AI regulation?
Well, if you look at the remarks that were made by Minister Malatsi, he actually spoke about the fact there were two things that were pointed out, to that particular point. The first one was that we need to, I believe the quote was, it must be for the betterment of all, right? I can actually pull it up because I was reading it just now. He said, our task is to ensure AI changes things for the betterment of all people, not just a few, right? So that already tells you that, it's top of mind, that if Africa and also some of these G20 nations, because, it's all over the world, right, don't get ahead of certain trends and all of that stuff, you might increase the digital divide. The digital divide may be exacerbated by AI. Second piece that he highlighted was the fact that we need to work to find ways that AI systems can reduce certain racial and gender bias that is known to exist or has been exhibited by some of the systems, and that works to, perhaps increase some of the divide that we're talking about.
And ethical practices have been quite important when it comes to AI. But how are these G20 countries trying to navigate that, and just the state of regulation, considering that there's no standard approach because it is a new space, a new industry?
So right now, everyone is trying to say, how do we learn from each other?
Okay.
Right. So that digital working group, that's the digital economy working group, I think that's the full name of it. Those are the things that they were debating. And one of the things that they're trying to do and say is, each individual country is already likely having, these policy discussions. South Africa, for example, is said to have its, national AI policy framework, starting, to go through some of the debates and all of that stuff from this month, right? We've seen that in Rwanda. Certain countries like Rwanda have already enacted something. The EU probably has the most comprehensive legislation. So the idea is, as G20 nations, how do we share with each other some of the best practices? Everyone is thinking about this thing. Everyone is at different levels and maturity in terms of regulating, coming up with laws, rules, and that type of thing. Let's share, some of the best practices so that we can improve each country's regulations when it comes to AI.
And talking about regulation, now, yes, this is a fairly new industry, and we are seeing different governments, racing to, implement laws around it. But are we also seeing a risk of it being over-regulated?
Well, this is already the biggest criticism against the EU's AI Act, right? When you look at the EU's AI Act, it's split into 4 areas, and these 4 areas have to do with risk. So they go minimal risk, which has to do with, let's say, spam filters, the normal algorithms that we deal with online, recommendation algorithm, all of those things, right? Minimal risk. Low risk, that's where they put in the deep fakes and the chatbots, so the chat GPTs and them, that's the layer, that they put. Then at the third layer, that's where they have what they call high risk. And high risk has to do with AI that can actually impact a person's life.
Okay.
So, for example, a credit scoring system, right? Your ability to access credit, that's something that could affect your actual life. Systems that impact hiring, right? Hiring score, because right now we actually engaged with a company locally called Blue Pearl that's using IBM's AI models to help with recruitment processes.
Okay.
Interestingly, Ayoko actually uses that platform for their own recruitment, right? But systems like that in the EU, they're saying this is high risk because it affects, people's lives. Healthcare, and also self-driving cars, because there's the human elements. Fourth level is what they call unacceptable risk. So things that are just not allowed by AI. So, for example, social scoring, like what we see in a country like China, they in the EU are saying this should just not be an area that that AI systems should touch at all. So, great piece of legislation.
Yes.
But the tagline is these guys are too quick to regulate, but slow to innovate, and that's been a running theme in the EU. They've got great legislation like GDPR, which is some of the best privacy legislation. In fact, South Africa's POPI Act is actually modeled, after Europe's GDPR. But the problem that a lot of people say is Europe, because of all this red tape, they don't have tech champions. They don't have, these big tech names that we see in China, in the United States, and other parts of the world, because they're stifling innovation using that regulation.
And I guess then the working group also, then you get to see that process of them breaking down what's within the EU regulation and using what they can use and using what works for them as well. With that in mind, with South Africa being the only African country within the G20, does this give the country, I guess, a bit of an edge when it comes to its African counterparts? I'm thinking of, you mentioned Rwanda that's making progress with its AI framework. I chatted to someone around Kenya's AI strategy, where they have a strategy for 2025 to 2030 that they are trying to implement. I know we're still working on ours, but does, being within the G20 and learning from, some champions within the industry and when it comes to regulation, does it give us a competitive edge?
I'll answer that in two ways.
Okay.
Firstly, I think it does give South African policymakers an edge in terms of at least learning from, some of the best when it comes to legislation that's either already been, promulgated or is in the process of, being promulgated. So you can hear from the best and brightest around the world, and that can feed into how South Africa is thinking about its policy. However, the problem with that is how quickly does that legislation actually come into effect, and then secondly, how much does that actually drive innovation in the space? So the second part of the answer that I was going to give you, which I think helps to answer it, is that one of the things that the minister is calling for is to say, apart from the racial and gender bias that we're seeing in some of the AI systems, there's also an opportunity that we increase diversity of languages.
Yes.
Right, that exist when it comes to some of these AI platforms. All you have to do is to watch a keynote of one of the large tech companies, and they show you what languages a certain platform is using at day one, and then how long it takes for some of the lesser used languages in the world to come on board. African languages, are infamously, not very well represented when it comes to these platforms. So South Africa's place in the G20 now becomes important in terms of at least helping to elevate, that discussion to say, how can we increase the diversity of languages to include, our African languages and that type of thing to, some of these platforms. So South Africa has an opportunity to lead when it comes to influencing how AI is developed around the world, but also to learn, and it all has to do with how quickly can they get the legislation done, and will it spur that innovation here?
And you know, we struggle with implementation in this country, but we will not get into that. Mudiwa, thanks so much for your time and joining us this afternoon. That was Business Day's Mudiwa Gavaza. Brought to you by IOCO, Africa's leading integrated technology services company.